Zahra Somani, and I will be the moderator for the first ALIF webinar. ALIF, which stands for American Lived Ismaili Faith, is a new, holistic, and interdisciplinary year-long program that enables 11th and 12th grade students to explore American Ismaili Muslim history and heritage and provides opportunities for college preparedness. This program will be replacing SHARE and will be implemented in REC during the REC year. Throughout the course of the program, students will be taking time to explore the true origins of American Muslims, which began well before the migration of the 1960s and stretches as far back as the 1400s. Students will explore the coming of Muslims through the transatlantic slave trade, their history and evolution in the US, and the diversity that exists among us. As our students come to appreciate our presence as a part of the American Muslim community, we'll take a closer look at what this means for us today and how the Quran and our faith implores us to serve our community and the ways in which we can do this here in our home context. In addition to this content, ALIF's holistic program includes sessions with our sister institutions, including college preparation, health and fitness, budgeting and planning, and integrated mental health lessons. The ALIF webinar series has been conceived as an initiative across the youth-serving Jamati institutions aimed at engaging the upper secondary students and their parents, but it is open to the entire Jamaat. The series aims to explore the foundational underpinnings of the ALIF program through developing a stronger understanding of engaging upper secondary students within the context of our faith. Before we begin, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous people as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long existing history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. We would like to open our session today by acknowledging the land on which I reside is the occupied, unceded, seized territory of Wichita and Caddo-affiliated tribes in the Dallas area. These tribes have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we would like to pay our respect to elders, both past and present. We believe the work we do in sessions like these are a part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous people on these lands and working towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Today, we will explore one of the key underpinnings to the ALIF program, which is why civilizations, why history. Today's session will provide an opportunity for us to explore why a critical reading of history is important to understanding our faith and world. During this session, you will also see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, let me introduce you to our speaker today. I could tell you about all the illustrious things that Dr. Dhanani has done in his time as a scholar, but I'll let you read that on the slide. Instead, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dhanani on a more personal level. I first met Dr. D over a decade ago when I was in London studying at the IIS. I can say with confidence that my classes with Dr. D changed the way I saw myself and my Ismaili community. He broadened my understanding of my faith and helped me to live and teach in a more authentic way. I am fortunate to keep running into him so that I can tell him how much I appreciated our time together. And I hope that in the course of today's critical conversations, you too get to experience some of the magic that I had as a student. One last thing, we'd like to note that the views of our speaker expressed during the course of this discussion are his own. Let us now turn to Dr. Dhanani.
So this view that we are living change and things around us change and our understandings change, I refer to it with this word called which I've used in teaching. I call it existentialism. Now, I'm not the first person to use it. It's normally used for a French literary movement, but I use it more like the way linguists use it, is that language is living. Language is living, and words may have meant certain things. They mean different things over time, and words are added. So they are living in that sense. Now, so when we think about words, let's just think about some common words. And I'm choosing them carefully, so I'm not. I may be thinking about common words, but rest assured that I have thought about which are the words I want to talk about. So I want to talk about the words like sun, solar system, fleas, mosquitoes, male, female, ethnicity, gender, nation. And I want to ask the question, have these words always had the same meaning? Now, so my argument is that they don't, but you can clearly say, what do you mean the sun has always been the sun? Oh, and well, I'd say that, look, at one point the sun was considered to be a planet because the earth was at the center, because the sun moved around the earth. Now we see the sun as a star around which the earth moves. So that's a huge change. And we call this system the solar system. The solar system had no meaning before the sun was at the center of the solar system, right? So you can see those two words. We think about fleas and mosquitoes. Well, what changes about that? Well, today with the theory of Darwinian evolution, we can probably say that there is a linkage between these two types of insects. Maybe there's an intermediary. Maybe they're also changing. So you can see that, even though they may be the same, let's say fleas and mosquitoes may have not changed so much over 300 years or whatever, but our conception of what they are, how we think about them, the way we can think about their DNA, which was unthinkable before, that's a change in how we think about them, right? So that's what I mean. Male and female is, well, there now we are kind of thinking about, well, are there only two genders? What about the in-between? And the in-between question is interesting because that's already raised by evolution, by Darwin. What about platypuses? Are they mammals or are they birds? So you can see that as our knowledge expands, we encounter things that force us to understand things in more complex ways. Similarly, ethnicity, gender, nation, these nations are changing. What does it, when on the US Census form, I have to say what my ethnicity is. I have to always scratch my head and try to guess what is intended, right? So this is, in a sense, certainly things like ethnicity, gender, and nation have policy implications. And in that sense, they are constructed. These words are clearly constructed to fit a particular conversation. Now, it is more difficult to argue in the case of the other words I talked about, but those two, in a way, are put together by human beings, and their meaning changes over time, perhaps not so much engaged with policy considerations, but you can see they too are socially constructed. So I think that, that's in a sense the kind of large picture of understanding that, we have this sense of things being changing. Some people would like to say things are permanent. And this permanent position in contrast is what I call essentialism. And then essentialism is a important discussion to have about religion. So let me turn it over to you.
I feel like I'm right back in class like I was a decade ago. And here I am thinking I knew one thing, and all of a sudden you're telling me the sun isn't the sun anymore, and I can feel my brain expanding. So, Dr. D, if you're saying that our concepts, including things like what we thought were, absolute, like sun or male and female, are just socially constructed, then isn't our understanding of the world and religion imperfect because it's no longer about anything like no real world? It feels like there's no real world or real religion. So how do I reconcile that then? Like, is anything real around me?
So obviously we know things are real because we live in a real world. I think we need to understand that real doesn't mean fixed. That is a really important realization. That real doesn't mean fixed or authentic. So in a religious sense, let's say one could say that there are people who believe there is an authentic Islam or an authentic Ismailism, and it never changes. It has been there since day one. You know, and when we say to them, well, but what about all the differences that you actually observe today and you observe historically? So that's a fact. You know, empirical diversity is a fact. And I think that you know that people would say, well, this is all bidah, this is innovation, this is not Islam, let's say. And we get into trouble when people who say these things actually have the power to enforce their views. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, right? So this position that there is only one way of looking at religion, and what I'm trying to suggest to you is certainly not possible to hold if you are going to be observant about what's happening around you. And if you are going to be charitable enough to say that, you know, I can't say, you know, Zahra, that you're not a good Ismaili. I mean, you know, I'm sure you're good Ismaili, but you're not an Ismaili like I am, right? So I think we need to be charitable. We can't read into people's commitments, and we cannot expect everybody to be the same, right? So when we think about, for example, very important for Islam is how we understand Prophet Muhammad. Muslims over time and over different geographies and different cultures have understood Prophet Muhammad in multiple ways. So what I would like to suggest is that religion is not one-dimensional authentic, but it is multi-layered. Its authenticity is in its lived aspect, that the authenticity of Indonesian Islam is authentic in its own way, just like the authenticity of Islam in Arabia in the 7th century. You don't have to understand Arabic, but you can love the Prophet in your own way, and the Prophet can be inspirational to you. And similarly, I think we can say the same thing about how the Imam has been understood in our South Asian tradition, or in the Syrian tradition, or in the Persianate traditions. You know, they're all different. And individually, we have differences, and we see those differences in our family. So religions are, I would say, complex, multi-layered. Interpretations are personal. And not only that, but we interact. I hear about your views, you hear about my views, we have a conversation, we broaden our understanding, we sometimes adopt things. So this is the thing that encounters, this is what encounters is about, right? And I just want to end by saying that if religion does not evolve and change, then we will have fossilized religion, which either is fossilized in a sense, or it doesn't basically survive. It dies like dinosaurs. So that's what I would want to say about essentialism and faith. And so I mentioned before the idea of becoming. The world is becoming. And people who believe that there is only one authentic believe that there is a perfect being. It's there. It's not becoming. It's already perfectly there. And by the way, this discussion goes back to Plato in the 4th century BC. So until we were able to rethink philosophy and science in the 17th century, we were stuck with these ideas of essences. And really the major change of how we think about the world is because we're no longer tied to essentialist ways of thinking about science. And that is particularly true in biology, with Darwin saying that species change over time. And therefore we need to accept the fact that religions change with time and context too.
That's helpful. So if we're getting comfortable with this idea of change and evolution, We know that, most of us are comfortable with it when it comes to Darwin and physics and evolution. And so you're telling me that we need to get comfortable with this dynamism in the social and human sciences as well, because you're saying that history is a part of this. So history, too, you're telling me, is not fixed, but rather dynamic and changing?
That's right. That's right. And I thought this would be a good point for us to listen to from one of your colleagues from Tajikistan, Nazira, who can tell us something about her own experience of this idea of history as changing and being able to, how it helped her in her own understanding and how it comes into the classroom.
When I was a student at school and I started my journey as a STEP teacher, I come across these questions. Why do we need to know and learn about history? Why not focus on today or our future instead of focusing on what happened in the past? My experience taught me that history can serve as a bridge between past and future, as well as it can serve as a bridge between people. I believe you agree with me that if you know more about the person, the more you start respecting the person. The person does not remain like a dog.
So I'm sorry, I think the
We
audio
cannot know about the person.
is not working very well here, so let's stop it.
Curiosity of our brain, with our biases, perception, and type.
Okay, so let me just say that Nazira describes in her discussion that, with having this background of understanding about history and in a way embracing that there are multiple ways of thinking about community and different perspectives towards faith, she finally had the courage to be able to understand the Sunnis in Tajikistan, because she's Pamiri, she didn't have much interaction with them, because she couldn't engage with a discussion about religion with them, and she couldn't even engage with the discussion about the first three caliphs, meaning Abu Bakr, Omar, and Usman. And she felt that when she came to the STEP program, we understood that history can be seen in this dynamic way. There is no essentialist way where we kind of ignore the fact that there were actually these three other caliphs. And she felt that these are attitudes that also she tries to think about in her classroom, because in her classroom in Australia, where most of her students in the STEP classroom are from the South Asian background, they talk about, let's say, reincarnation, which is not something that is found in the other discussions of the Islamic tradition. So she said that these are ways of thinking about history and change, in which we can see that if we hold essentialist views, we get stuck. But if we're able to be broader and understanding, then we're able to move forward further.
That makes sense. And I really liked what she said about the more you get to know somebody, the more you respect them, which I think is a good way for us to appreciate and understand our own history. So, the reality, though, that even Nazira shared is that there's a majority of Muslims and even followers of other religions that hold that there's just one authentic way. How do we negotiate with that? Because, they have a fixed understanding, but there's a conservative movement in all faiths. And how do we risk not becoming relative if we're not able to at least agree on certain facts?
I think we fall into this trap of relativism. It's a trap, because that's the argument that's put forward by conservatives. So if you don't agree with us, you're being relative. I think what we are trying to say is we're being realist. To accept change is to be a realist, is to understand that this is the way the world is. We're not in a cocoon ignoring the world around us. So I would want to just not fall into the trap of saying that this is, that not to accept an unchanging fate is to be a relativist. I think it is to actually acknowledge, and a very important thing for us as curriculum constructors is to acknowledge agency, so that we are agents of our own understanding, importantly, and in a sense also when we are engaged in the classroom and trying to help our students becoming adults in their own right, that they understand agency that they have in formulating their own understanding, not having understanding imposed on them. And I think it's very important that the Quran asks people to reflect. It doesn't just follow what your forefathers have told you. And in fact, it's extremely critical. That's the exact critique of the Meccan idolaters, that they just follow what their forefathers had said to them, when in front of them in the everyday experience, the creation of God should show them an experiential God in that sense. And so I think that existentialism is about experientialism. It's being empirical. And in that sense, it's a much more reality-based view than an essentialist-based view. So I would actually turn the question around. But let's talk a little bit about this idea of agency. That we have a curriculum that obviously you have been engaged in constructing, and I think it's very important to recognize that curricula are in a way contested, and so it kind of comes into this larger discussion that we have. Is if we're in the US, we can see that contestation going on. We see it in the social studies curriculum, for example. And so, I was listening to a radio program the other day, which was very interesting, which was, about an educationist talking about the social studies curriculum. And basically, she pointed out that the social studies curriculum is really, in a way, educating about how, becoming socialized to become a US citizen. And so the narrative there, obviously in the past, was about the great big white men, most of them old, who in a way were this individual big heroes who made, this document and who fought this, the British and so forth. And now we have this huge country, and in a way, this became the essentialist narrative, that this is the authentic narrative of what it is. So this is about American rugged individualism exemplified in the founding fathers. And I think that as we, first of all, as African-American, the African-American role in US history, which has been neglected, which has been forgotten, in a way, forgotten deliberately, right? So you can see here that as their role, and they demanded, they basically struggled to have their role recognized. For example, in Massachusetts, where I am, in the town that I live in, we have a Patriots Day parade in April, and one of the Patriots Day participants is African American, and we know that there were African Americans in the battle for independence. So this is something, that's the history that gets erased. So you can see here that, as people, immigrants, for example, have contributed to the history of the United States, and the social studies curriculum can no longer be the account of rich white landowning men, but it has to include how others, including immigrants, including African Americans, have contributed, and also how groups have been, in a way, systematically denied their rights. So we think about, certainly the slaves. We can think about the internment of the Japanese. We can think about, in a way, women not getting the right to vote. There are all of these other aspects that we need. If we are going to be serious about what we study in history, then we can learn not only from our successes, but from the fact that we were open enough to learn from our failures. And I think that's a very, very important thing, because I think much more teaching occurs in our failures. And so here we see that US history, US identity is also complex and multi-layered. And what we are actually seeing in a way is that last fight to keep the bastion of that master narrative of white privilege around, right? Now, in terms of us, what are the lessons for us really? And the lessons for us is also that we also have multiple diversities in the United States as Ismailis. And the question becomes, how do we celebrate them? How do we deepen them? How do we be inclusive of all of these different origins that we have? And also, how do we not only celebrate them, but make them possible to grow in the future, that they don't get stifled? Because, you know, we obviously have dominant groups in North America of Ismaili traditions, and we have much smaller groups of other traditions. But I think it's very important to recognize that, you know, we need to make sure that the other groups continue to grow too. I think the second thing, so that's one thing I would say is very important for curricular considerations, is this just the diversity that we have, and making people aware of it and helping it and nurture it. The second thing is, what do we as Muslims in America need to know about the Muslim presence that you alluded to? But what do we need to know about the challenges of Islamophobia? And this is really, really important, because these are things that are going on right now. And the third thing I would suggest is the challenge that the Imam gave us, which is how to be ambassadors of Islam. How can we represent Islam? And I think that that moves us beyond just the understanding of Islam in America to a larger dimension of Islam. So those are some of the things that I think that as we think about what to cover in a curriculum, I would want to think about those things.
I really like how we've moved this discussion along, because I think that after the initial shock of, you know, the idea that there's more to it than just the one narrative that we have learned growing up, there is an appreciation, and I really like how you reframed it from being relativist to being realist, because I think you're right. The reality is that there wasn't ever just one narrative or one understanding of the way that history unfolded, and that often we use erased narratives or dominant narratives to control and to wield power, whether it's, you know, for women, against women, or against certain immigrant groups. And we rewrite something to keep a story in place. And so I really appreciated how you reframed that for us, but also then proceeded to explain, well, if we are going to rewrite the narrative, and if we are going to include, you know, these erased narratives that are not a part of the dominant social studies curriculum, then what is it that we would include? And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Not just what our history has been, but what our role is today as these immigrant or religious groups that are included in the American fabric. So that's really helpful. Dr. Dhanani, I'd like to turn our conversation to the second part of our title, which is the why civilization. So we've seen history and its importance and how to diversify it, but Hazram talks a lot about the word civilization. Can you give us some insight into the background of this, this discourse within the IS secondary curriculum and how that continues in ALIF program?
Yes, so I think, so, you know, Hazram has been talking about civilization for a long time. And, you know, he himself was a student of history at Harvard. What people really don't know very well is actually Hazram wanted to study architecture, and he got admitted into MIT. And actually it was Sultan Ahmad Shah who asked him to switch to Harvard a year after having been a student in architecture at MIT. So you can see he's pursuing, he found a way to pursue his passion for architecture. But Sultan Ahmad Shah thought that his knowledge of Islam, because he did study Islamic history, would be important for him when he became the Imam. And this engagement with Islamic civilization has been there with him since his student days. So when we were thinking about the secondary curriculum and we were trying to put together the first volume, for which we have a slide, we had to think about, okay, so how do we introduce the idea of civilization? So we thought, you know, it wasn't long before we said we need to start with Ibn Khaldun. So let's just say something about Ibn Khaldun. So that's the first two volumes on Muslim societies and civilizations, for those of you who have had a chance to go through the STEP curriculum. And then let's say something about Ibn Khaldun. So Ibn Khaldun is this extremely famous figure. He's not well known in the Western world because he wasn't translated, but he is extremely important, and you know, everybody should know about it, which is why actually the civilization discussion begins with Ibn Khaldun. He was a Qadi, he was a political advisor to many rulers, including Granada. So he ended up in Granada for a little bit. And he also was in Egypt, where he negotiated peace with Tamerlane, who was, you know, in Damascus and had basically conquered until Damascus. So he, you know, the conquest of Egypt was at stake. He was sent out. So this is how important he is. But for us, he's important because he wrote a history of North Africa. And in that history of North Africa, he wrote a very serious introduction to it, which is a sociological account of civilization. So this is a, you know, it's a, in English, it's a 3-volume work. So it's a very significant discussion of what is civilization. So if we go to the next slide, I can kind of introduce this work, and then we can move on to some of the discussions about the Imam. So he, you know, is very interested in what his, you know, historical errors. So he basically says, you know, we can't believe everything that's told us. So he's talking about history as a critical, activity. You know, so he says that, you know, their accounts and people who write Quranic commentaries say, oh yeah, Moses' army had 600,000 people. And he says, you know, this is ridiculous. You cannot have 600,000 people that are commanded by one person. It's too big to act as a unit. You cannot reasonably even fit in one place. And how would the commanders even get together to discuss what they're going to do? So just very practical, common sense views of what a historian should do. And interestingly for us, he dismisses the claims that the Fatimids are not Alid in their origin, because he says these views are basically because of bias against the Shia or the Fatimids. So very interesting. And then his student Al-Makrizi actually later writes, gives us a detailed account of the Fatimids, which is a major source that we have. So moving on, then we move on to the next slide, which is about his discussion about civilization. He is interested in the dynamics of how you know, these rulerships work, and he says that, you know, we have the smaller units, but you know, they participate in a larger unit over a long span of time. This is civilization. Civilization is the largest human social unit there can be. And so his introduction is a study of the causes of civilization, some of its features, and what are some of its institutions. And I outline those in the next slide, where we can very briefly go over. And so he basically says, in civilization, at least with regards to Muslim civilization, we have a religious founder. And the religious founder has, in a way, laid out an ethical framework. He's laid out the idea of revelation. He's laid out his example, right? And then there are people who study it. There are religious scholars, and there are legal institutions. Those are one aspect of Muslim civilization. But the political aspect, what he calls royal authority, is in a way secular. You know, even though it relies upon some of the institutions that arise out of religious norms, the political rulership is about stability, so that you can enable economic activity, so you can enable scholarship, so that you can engage in all kinds of activities that are about civilization. So he talks about economic activity, he talks about markets, he talks about how markets need oversight, how they need to be fair. So, you know, this is economics way before Adam Smith, you know, these kinds of discussions. He's interested in scholarship in both secular and religious disciplines and its institutions. He's interested in the different kinds of trades, the different kind of skills. And he's also and he believes that a civilization is engaged in the arts, in literature, in calligraphy, and so forth. So you will find discussions of philosophy, about physics, about chemistry, you know, and I'm not talking about a paragraph, we're talking about pages here with names and so forth. So very, very interesting view of civilization as a whole. And so that kind of brings us to kind of talk about Hazrat Imam's view. And so, like I mentioned to you, Hazrat Imam had this background, but I think it's extremely important what he said at the banquet in Houston in 2002, which was kind of his first public discussion of 9/11. And so here he is talking about what I would call misrepresentation of Islam. And he says that the faith of a billion people is not part of the general education process in the West, and is ignored by school and college curricula in history, sciences, philosophy, and geography. So all of these disciplines should have, Muslims entering into this discussion, and they don't, right? And then he says that we need to, responsible education should ring fence the theologizing image of the Muslim world. The Muslim world is just seen in terms of its sects, in terms of its beliefs, in terms of, it's not, if you go beyond it and you consider it civil society, politics, economics, not just today, but at various points in its history, to understand its development, to understand agency, to understand how people got together to solve problems. If you do that, then you understand the diversity and pluralism of Muslim peoples, their cultures, their histories, their philosophies and legal systems. And so even though this is a critique of the Western general education, I think it really tells us what we ought to be doing in our classrooms. Are we covering the same kind of understanding of Islam? Because if we do, then what it means to be an ambassador of Islam becomes very different enterprise. It means to talk about Islam in this civilizational way, not in a theological way, and in that sense, making Muslims real people, not just, like paper, some shadows that are only interested in prayer and the afterlife. No, they do much, much more than that, as Ibn Khaldun points out. Then can we go to the next slide? And I just want to make one more remark, and then we can, we're running a little bit short of time, so we can conclude. So here again, I think the Imam talks about, I would hope to see the day when the definition of an educated person in the Judeo-Christian world would include an intelligent understanding of the Muslim world. That person would appreciate the eminent position of Islamic civilizations in human thought and knowledge that would include an understanding of their traditions of research and achievement, from philosophy and the arts to the sciences, architecture, and engineering. And again, I think this is not just a challenge for the Western world, but it's for us to know our history and to be able to actually do exactly what this says. So if you don't mind, Zahra, since we're short of time, I wanted to just have a 1-minute video of Ryan Makhani, who is an American step teacher, say something about his understanding of US history and how it also evolved.
Growing up, I always saw history as one-dimensional, as facts and dates. Only later did I start seeing it as multidimensional, as stories. My parents came from Pakistan, met, married, and had me in Chicago. I was raised in the Bay Area, in California, and then later in life, I lived in Atlanta, New York, and now again in Houston. What it means to be American, as well as American history, is quite different in California, in Texas, and in New York. It is a different set of stories. When teaching Islam, I often share with my students this multi-dimensional approach, building on civilizations. And it allows us to see and explore the multi-dimensional nature of history of Islam and the many stories.
So in conclusion, if we can go on to the next slide, I'd like to say that what Hazrat Imam has emphasized in terms of discussing civilization is that civilization is engagement in all areas of human activity. And Muslims have done that in the past and continue to do that. But the important thing about civilization is civilization now in which you practice the ethics of your faith. So ethics of the faith, in one sense, is this idea of custodianship, being the Khalifa of the human, natural, and cultural worlds. But it also means that we face common problems. Let's say right now, we have the ecological disaster of global warming. How are we going to solve that problem, right? And we also have to be mindful of inequity and injustice. So in a sense, this is how we think about institutions that are about education in the Muslim world in the past and today, about health, about social welfare. And these are continuing aspects of Muslim civilizations that are present in the Quran, and the Muslims acted on it and dealt with it either publicly or privately. And so when we think about civilization in our curriculum, there is one aspect to understand it in terms of our identity, but it's also to say that our ethics are lived and are found in our understanding of civilization. And because the civilization of Islam is not just of the past, but we need to carry it on into the future, we need to be very clear that we carry these values forward and know there are significant contributions that people in the past have made.
Thank you. I feel like, that's really beautifully weaved together, because often you find that sometimes as students or as scholars or just as general people, we get really excited about our past and we forget that there's not just our identity is not just our past, but also our future. And what I really like about what you said is I see a lot of resonance with this ALIF program that we're launching. One, because as Ibn Khaldun has taught us, it is time to question the things that we were told and to find the holes in the narratives that we were presented, which is exactly what we do. But I think even more so, it's this idea that very much so, once we understand our history and who we are as citizens or as civilians, then what do we do about this? And that's exactly what we're hoping that our program does, right? Is take our newer understanding of what it means to be a part of this American Muslim fabric and own that and say, all right, if this is my history, then what does this mean for me going forward? And how do I then take this along with not just my understanding of myself, but my responsibility as a Khalifa, as a Muslim? And what does it then mean to serve my community in this kind of way? What do my ethics look like? And it's exactly what you said, which we're hoping we'll cover, in the next couple of years with this program, is this idea of what does this mean then for climate change? What does this mean for representation and diversity and inclusion? What does this mean for elder justice? And these are all very relevant problems of today, not just of the past, that we need to be able to confront with the confidence that this is what our faith teaches us and that this is who we are. So I really appreciate that, you helped us to bring this together and to understand the principles that underlie the secondary curriculum and how that translates directly into what our 11th and 12th grade students will, inshallah, be experiencing in the next few years. So thank you, Dr. Dhanani, for a wonderful conversation. And thank you to our audience for joining us today for our first ALIF webinar. A couple of announcements before you go. To learn more about ALIF and to join the team or to teach or train or coach, please visit the website that we will be posting in the chat. We would love if you're enthusiastic about this, if you feel inspired by today, we would love to have you on our team. So we are looking for teachers and staff members to help disseminate this new program. And if you are interested in the ALIF curriculum in particular and want to know more, you are welcome to come join us every Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern. We have office hours with my team and myself, so the developers of the ALIF curriculum, and we'd be happy to answer your questions and to delve more deeply into some of the topics that we talked about today. And lastly, there is a survey for you to take. So please indulge us with your feedback so that we know how to make this more accessible and better for you in the future. It'll pop up on your screen as you leave. And that's it for today. Thank you so much, and Yali Madat.